Stanford University.
All right, hello everybody, and welcome to what I personally think is one of the most fun lectures, because now we really can just assume we have all these basic Lego blocks and we can build some awesome stuff, namely dynamic neural networks for question answering. In terms of organization, there's not too much going on today, except hopefully all of you are working hard on PA4 and on your projects. I'll have my project advice office hour today right after class. Q status 90, I'll be on Hangout and everything. Any questions around the projects? Where you want to be? Nope. All right. So let's get started. Now, why is PA4 so open-ended, and why do we think it's so exciting as a problem set? Basically, the question that I want to ask today, and maybe you can also ask yourself during your projects and your problem sets, is whether we may be able to cast all NLP tasks actually as a question answering problem. And this question is what led us to invent the dynamic memory network, which we'll talk about today. So what do I mean by this? Let's go through a couple of examples of what question answering might look like. The first one here is sort of the standard question answering type of problem where we have some inputs, we have a question, and we need to do some logical reasoning maybe to answer that question. So for instance, here the inputs are Mary walked to the bathroom, Sandra went to the garden, Daniel went back to the garden, Sandra took the milk there, and now we ask, where's the milk? Now, in order to do this, we would have to actually do a little bit of reasoning, because if you just try to retrieve the sentence or the last sentence that mentions milk, well, then it would tell you that just Sandra took the milk there, and you don't know where Sandra is, and hence where there, what there refers to. So we now have to do some anaphora resolution. If we were to try to build sort of a hand-tuned, old-school machine learning NLP system where we put our human knowledge into the task to answer that question. And if we were to do that, then we'd realize, all right, well, let's try to find out where Sandra is, and then we look at this sentence and see that she is in the garden last, and then we could answer the question correctly. Now, by the end of this class, you'll know a model that you don't have to give any of that kind of information to. It will actually just learn all of this from examples of this kind. Now, that's a standard Q&A problem, but you can also look at sentiment, where we might have an input here, everybody's happy. And again, we'll have a question, what's the sentiment? And the answer is just the label, essentially the word pertaining to that label, namely positive. Now, we can go further. We had the tasks of sequence tagging, like named entity recognition and part-of-speech tagging. And we can also ask what are the named entities. And then we might want to obtain either a list that could include a lot of O's for not a named entity, or just a list of the actual words that are named entities. And again, input, question, answer, triplet that we would need for training that kind of model. Same with what are the part-of-speech tags. Every word has a part-of-speech tag, so that's a sequence of the same length as the input. And we can even go as far as, and this is starting to be questionable of how useful it is, but maybe we can cast also machine translation as a question answering problem, right? In the end, most every NLP problem has some input, some question you want to answer about it, and some output, some answer. So now, with that in mind, wouldn't it be amazing if we were able to build a single joint model for general question answering? Can basically learn from any input, question, answer, triplet data set. Now, towards a single joint model for this comprehensive QA, there are two major obstacles. So let's talk about what they are. The first one is that we don't even have a single architecture, or up until last year when we published a paper that solves all these, there was no single architecture that consistently got state-of-the-art across these different tasks. So for question answering, we had strongly supervised memory networks. For sentiment analysis, we actually used tree-structured LSTM, so similar to the recursive neural networks that Chris talked about 2 lectures ago, but using the ideas of having various gates as you combine words and phrases into phrase vectors of longer length. And then for part of speech tagging, it used to be a bidirectional LSTM conditional random field, another type model family that we didn't go into any details in this class in, sort of in the graphical models world. What you do notice is that all the state-of-the-art models have some kind of neural network in them somewhere these days. That's one of the reasons we merged 224D and 224N. Felt like you really need to know these basic building blocks. But there's still different kinds of models that make different kinds of assumptions, and we would call these different kinds of architectures, right? Like, so the architectures that we've talked about so far are sort of bag of words, window-based, convolutional neural network, recurrent neural networks, LSTMs, and so on. So that's the first major obstacle. Now, the second one is that fully joint multitask learning is actually incredibly hard. And what I mean by saying that is that we don't just want to share some parts of the model, like word vectors, which we're already pretty good at sharing, but we want to have the exact same decoder or classifier, and we don't want to just transfer between a single source and one target task, but we want to ideally train both of them jointly. So in computer vision, I'll encourage you all to take 231 next quarter, I think, when it's getting offered on convolutional neural networks for computer vision. Computer vision is actually better able to share more of the layers as you go up the stack, whereas in NLP, so far, when you try to do multitask learning and share weights, what we've been mostly able to do so far is to share the word vectors, right? We train the word vectors, and then we initialize some other model with those pre-trained word vectors. Nobody yet consistently got improvements, though it's an active area of research, to share deeper layers of the LSTM, for instance. So you train the system on machine translation, and you just change the last layer of the softmax, and now say instead of machine translation, I want to do sentiment analysis or something like that. There hasn't been any paper yet on showing improvements for that. And even worse, it's hard to publish negative results, and you'll only ever read about successful transfer learning cases because the unsuccessful ones don't get published. But when you actually do research in this area, you'll notice that as soon as the tasks are not directly related, they actually tend to hurt each other. So if you're trying to train 2 tasks together in one model, say you just have 2 softmaxes on the same hidden state of your LSTMs, it turns out to actually get worse in many cases too. So those are some of the 2 major obstacles. Now, the dynamic memory networks that I'll talk to you today about only tackle the first obstacle, as in they're an architecture which still has hyperparameters that might differ for different tasks, but it's at least the same general modules that you have in that architecture. And basically, it can tackle all these different tasks that I described to you, at least in some capacity, and several of them actually at the state-of-the-art level at the time of publication. All right, any questions around these obstacles and sharing and the idea of multitask learning? So basically, we're thinking of multitask learning through the lens of seeing everything as a question over some kind of input that has some kind of answer. All right, so let's look at the high-level idea for answering these tougher kinds of questions. So imagine you had this story. Each of the facts is relatively simple and straightforward. John went to the hallway and things like that. But imagine I now asked you, after you read it, where's Sandra, right? And now you might have to actually try to retrieve the episode in which that fact or the answer to that question was actually mentioned. And so in some cases, as we saw with the football, you may actually have to go multiple times over the input to answer that question correctly. And this is kind of what led us to this idea of the dynamic memory network. So this is the kind of architecture that you would see a lot in papers, and so we're going to walk through it first on a high level intuitively, and then we'll zoom into the different areas to gain a better understanding. Now, the first thing you'll notice is we have different modules. This is what I call sort of model components. And the reason we're basically separating them out is that I think eventually you have to do deep learning research and also generally engineering through or with the help of good software engineering practices, where you have different modules, they define interfaces, and you might be able to switch out one module with another one, but that doesn't mean you have to change all the other modules in your larger architecture. So that's generally a good sort of modeling framework. Now, what does this dynamic memory network do? So it starts with having simple word vectors like love or word2vec, and basically we'll have a recurrent neural network sequence model, such as GRU, that goes over the input and just computes a hidden state at every word and at every sentence. All right, so standard GRU that we've defined very carefully before. Now, that's just independent of the question. It will just basically compute a hidden state for every word. Now, it will have also a GRU for the question in the question module. In fact, sometimes you can share also the weights between the question and the input here, these GRUs. And we'll basically use a GRU to compute a question vector. That question vector Q is just going to be the last hidden state of the GRU after it went through every word of the question. Now, and this is where the interesting stuff starts, we'll use these attention mechanisms that you've learned about before in a very specific way. We'll define it soon. But we'll have this attention mechanism that is essentially triggered by the question to go over the inputs. So here, the question is, where's the football? And now, basically, we would assume that the fact that football was mentioned in this question is stored somewhere inside the hidden state of that last time step GRU, and we call that Q. Now, we use Q to essentially trigger an attention mechanism over all the potential inputs. And whenever there's a strong attention being paid to a specific sentence, we're going to give that sentence as input to yet another GRU, and that is in the episodic memory module. Now, whenever we have a line like this here, we basically assume that is some kind of recurrent neural network sequence model. All right? So basically, question triggers an attention mechanism that goes over all the hidden states of all my inputs, and now basically says, this fact seems relevant for this question at hand. So for instance, where's the football? Well, the last sentence that mentions football seems relevant, right? And the hidden state of this GRU captures that there's something mentioned about a football, and the hidden state of this GRU captures that there's something about football. So we store this, and now this GRU agglomerates only the facts that are pertinent or relevant to the question at hand. So it's essentially a filtering GRU that tries to only keep track of what's relevant for the current question. And now we'll define this memory state here as the last hidden state of that GRU. Now, for the next iteration, because again here, John put down the football, we don't know where John is. So we now have stored in this vector M that in order to answer the current question, it seems pertinent. And again, the model learns all of these things, of course, by itself. We don't manually tell it these are objects, these are people, or colors, or anything like that. But we basically now store in this vector M that John and football seem relevant to the question at hand, which namely, where's the football? And so as we go over the input again, we'll take M and Q into consideration in order to answer this question and basically pay attention to now every fact that mentions both John or the football. And so in this case here, and these are realistic numbers, you basically pay a lot of attention to John moved to the bedroom and John went to the hallway. And that is the last sentence that seems relevant. And so the attention scores for subsequent and previous sentences here are very low. We'll store this. And now M is given as input, and so the 0th time step to give to yet another GRU that then just has our standard softmax classifier at every hidden state to produce an answer. All right, so there's a lot to digest. This is probably the most complex model we've looked at so far. But all the components of this model we've already discussed. But this is kind of where research is right now. There are a lot of folks who are trying to find new kinds of architectures for different kinds of problems. And in this particular case, we're trying to find a general architecture that should be possible or should be usable across a whole host of different kinds of tasks. So we'll zoom in a second into these different modules, but are there any questions about the general idea of the model, the general architecture? Great, so what are the two different tracks of the episodic memory module? Essentially, these tracks are mirrored perfectly with the input. So there are always as many time steps in the episodic memory module here as there are time steps in the input. But the model either can decide whether a classifier or just goes over the input a fixed number of times, somewhere between 2 to 5. And every time it goes over it, it tries to basically pay attention to different kinds of sentences in the input, depending on what the question is and what it has so far agglomerated in terms of relevant facts from the previous time step, or previous episode in this case. So here, again, we go over it, the input the first time, store things and facts about John and the football, and then the second time, we'll now pay attention to John facts too. And so intuitively, again, the first pass, I asked, where's the football? And at this state here, John moved to the bedroom just doesn't seem relevant to ask the question, to answer the question, right? Because John moving to the bedroom has nothing to do with the football. So you have to, in order to do transitive reasoning, as in, if A to B is in B to C and C to D, now if you want to go from A to D, you need to understand the steps to get there. So this kind of transitive reasoning capability you can only get if you have multiple passes over your input. So the question is, if we had some adverbs or temporal expressions and asked sort of different kinds of questions like, was John there before, or various other kinds of questions like that. And the answer is, there's surprisingly many things it can learn if it has seen them in the training data. So this kind of model will not be able to come up with completely new kinds of reasoning and types of reasoning. But if you show it a lot of temporal reasoning, it will be able to answer those kinds of questions. So yeah, I don't see why it couldn't, for some theoretical reason, answer the questions of where was he before that or things like that. That's right. So M1, sort of M superscript 1, that's right. So the question is, in the first pass, we mostly use the question. It turns out we'll actually copy the question twice, and in the second pass, we'll replace the second copy of Q with M1, but sort of a detail. In general, yes, we'll only use the information of Q for the first pass. Once we have the second pass, we'll use M1 and Q to understand the attention. And again, that way, we hope that M is agglomerating the facts that are relevant to answer the question. All right, great question. So now let's zoom into the model in detail. In some cases, it's pretty easy. We basically just have a standard GRU. But maybe before I define the different modules, in the end here, we have, again, the softmax. And so whenever you see softmax, you can think of cross-entropy error as your training objective. And now, because of how we defined the modules, we can train this entire architecture end to end. You just have to give it an input sequence, a question, and an answer. And now from this answer here, we basically will make errors in the beginning, and then we'll have high entropy error, and then we basically backpropagate through all these vectors here, through everything, all the way into the word vectors. And we can train this whole system end to end. And that's really where the power of deep learning and these kinds of architectures comes in. So the question is, should we have some attention from the answer module also sort of skipping the episodic memory module's attention and going directly to the input? And the answer is yes. For the tasks that we had, we did not even try that because we solved them to the state-of-the-art level and slightly above. But what we actually have found is that it makes sense in the second iteration on a harder data set, namely the Stanford question answering data set that you all are going to work on, to actually have a co-attention mechanism where you want to reinterpret the question also in terms of the input. So for instance, intuitively, if you have a question, may I cut you? Then the interpretation is very different if the person asking the question is holding a knife or if somebody's standing in line in a supermarket, right? And so sometimes the interpretation of your question is actually different depending on the input. And so you want to have co-attention mechanisms. And I think you can also, essentially attention is kind of a fun concept right now that a lot of people are sprinkling into a lot of different places and a lot of different kinds of models. And I think this would be a very fine way to do it too, or place to do it. All right, so we train everything end-to-end, cross-entropy error, standard stuff. Now, the input module is a standard GRU. And again, in this particular case here where we have very simple sentences and facts about each sentences, we'll actually make that last hidden state of each sentence explicitly accessible when we answer the question. Now, one improvement that we've made on the second iteration is instead of having just a unidirectional GRU, we actually have a bidirectional GRU on top here, and then each sentence is represented via the concatenation of both the left to right and right to left direction. Now, the question also just is standard GRU. We have here our word vectors. We call them VT here. And basically, we just get QT, and then we'll drop the subscript T for the last hidden state, just to simplify notation in subsequent slides. All right, now where it gets interesting is that episodic memory part. And we've already seen some attention mechanisms, and this one is slightly different. Basically, we'll have the attention mechanism here, which I'll define in the next slide, of G. G is just a single scalar number. Should I pay attention to this sentence at the ith time step or not? Now, the superscript here refers to the iteration or the episode, the tth time that we went over the entire input. So we start here with t equals 1, and then we go up to t equals 2. And if we go over the input 5 times, which of course is also kind of slow, we'd have here h superscript 5. But the main idea is essentially that we have a global gate on top of a standard GRU. So this global gate will basically say this entire sentence does not matter or does matter a lot. And instead of having every single hidden state have its own gate, we just turn off the entire GRU if a fact doesn't seem relevant. So if Gi at the ith sentence in the tth episode and pass over the entire input is 0, what we'll do is basically just entirely copy that h vector forward. No computation really necessary, no updates to any of the units whatsoever. And so intuitively, that makes a lot of sense, right? If we have sentences like Sandra went back to the kitchen and we're asking about the football, and maybe eventually we'll figure out something about John and so on, it's completely irrelevant to have other facts about other people going to other places. And that's really easy to capture with this single scalar G. Now, the last remaining question is, well, how do we compute that G? And the main idea here is actually fairly simple and straightforward. We essentially compute this vector z here with a bunch of simple similarities between a sentence vector, that's again the hidden state of at the end of each sentence, the question vector, and our memory state from the previous iteration. And m0 here will just be initialized to be the question. So in the very first iteration, just have these two twice. But that way we can use the exact same mechanism in the first, second, and third iteration and higher. Now, what kinds of similarities are we measuring here? These are all element-wise, and these are just Hadamard products, so multiplicative interactions between the sentence and the question and each sentence and the memory state. And then here we just have element-wise subtraction and absolute value. So just basically two very simple similarity metrics between the three vectors that we have. Yeah. Is there a reason why we don't use the inner product for similarity? We actually tried it, and in the first version of the paper, we even had things like question transpose times W times a sentence, for instance. So this way, we have an even more powerful similarity metric that's multiplicative, but can weight different elements of the vectors and so on. It turned out after we've done some ablation studies, again, something you should all do for your projects too, if we removed that, we had the same accuracy. And whenever you can remove something from your model, you should. So we just picked it out. Now, once we have this feature vector here, just essentially it, right? It's a vector that has all the similarities between these different sentences. We just plug that into a standard true-layer neural network, standard 10H hidden unit. We're very familiar at this point with these equations. We have a linear layer here, and then we basically put a softmax on top of that, so all the attention scores sum to 1. And in some ways, this could actually be a limiting factor, right? Because that means that I can only pay attention to so many things very, very strongly each time I go over the data set. And we might not always want to do that. Maybe we want to pay 100% attention to 5 different facts. It turns out to work reasonably well for some data sets, but sometimes you might also, instead of having a single softmax, have just sigmoids, so you can pay a lot more attention to a lot of different things. And then at the very end here, these two lines turn out to also be a GRU, but one that won't have very many time steps. It's basically a GRU that goes from each of the memory states to the next memory state and agglomerates the facts that have been agglomerated over time here. Turns out that is actually not an important parameter. Eventually, we replaced that GRU with a standard rectified linear unit type of two-layer neural network, and that worked well too. But first iteration of the model had a GRU between these two states as well. All right, any questions about the episodic memory module and how we agglomerate facts, how we compute the attention? Cool. Could you raise your hand if you feel like all these modules and how we put them together make sense to you? All right, to the people who haven't raised their hand, can you formulate any kind of question around why it doesn't make sense or what confuses you? Yeah. That's exactly right. So the question is, on a very high level, we're going over the input multiple times, because every time we go over the input, we can learn to pay attention to different kinds of sentences. That's right. So basically, intuitively here, I'll just rephrase your question in the answer, which is basically, when I go over the inputs, these sentences here, SI, for the first time, maybe SI here captures facts about John, but my question here is about football. So in the very first iteration, and MT-1, M0 is just initialized to the question 2, so it's essentially not adding anything either, because we haven't gone over the inputs an entire time yet. So really, we only have these two factors. The sentence, which basically in your hidden state, we hope captures some facts about John having moved to the hallway or somewhere. But the question is just asking where the football is. So the similarity between this vector and this vector is not going to be very high. And then we plug this long feature vector into this two-layer neural network. But no matter what, the two sentences just don't seem very related. And so that this two-layer neural network will not learn or be able to identify that this sentence seems relevant for the question. And so this gate G here will just be very small. But then in the second iteration, we've basically added one sentence that connected John and hallway. And so now in our hidden state M that had gone through this GRU here, so that last hidden state we define here as M, now captured from the very first iteration that John put down the football seems relevant. So now M has, in its hidden state, some facts about both John and the football. And now those similarities can be picked up by this attention mechanism. And basically now in the next iteration, as we move over the sentence again, give a higher attention score to that sentence that mentions John. That's right. A sentence is just a GRU or some bag of averaging. That's a great question. So there are actually, so there are a bunch of different, I'll get to this in a second, don't worry. There are a bunch of different kinds of things that people have tried and checked if this works. And one of them is actually basic coreference. So being able, like requiring to answer a question that it's he, and then asking, who does he refer to, and then finding the right person. And so the model can actually do this very accurately as long as it sees that. And so the way it would do that is just basically noticing how inside here, you mention John or you mention he, and then it learns to just go back and find like the next previous kind of sentence that mentions any kind of name, for instance. And it could learn more complex patterns than that too. But again, it would have to have these multiple passes to be able to now go back to something that it didn't make sense in the first time you went from left to right reading it. Yeah. But you would hope that the sentence vectors capture what is in the sentence. That's right. So sorry, to rephrase what you said, I guess that wasn't quite a question, but what's important here, yeah, as the line goes through, the last hidden state of S2 of that second sentence is the input and the H0 of the next sentence. So it's a one continuous GRU. And you would hope that as it mentions John, it keeps track of that in one of its hidden states, something happened about John. And then as it reads in he and updates our hidden states, we would hope that it captures something about the two being connected now. That's right. So the question is, has there been a study of using this exact model on coreference resolution? And the answer is yes. We actually played around with it. And there are some data sets where we actually did really well on. But we also had to modify the model slightly. There's some various tips and tricks that will be a little bit outside the scope of this lecture. So there's nothing in theory of why this couldn't work at all for coreference. The main problem is there are lots of different kinds of patterns. And you need a lot of training data to show the model what kinds of patterns you might want to capture for coreference. And then the main problem in coref is that you might want to have an answer for every pair of words and saying, do these two words co-refer to each other or not? And can get kind of slow. And so there's some issues, but there's no reason of why this model in general couldn't do Coref. The main tricky bit and why you needed actually modifications is to squeeze Coref into a question answering problem, which is not very intuitive. The question would then be, so for instance, let's say you have this whole sentence and there are a couple of he's and she's in there, and now you ask what does he refer to, and it wouldn't know which he you even mean from the question. So then you'd have to say, what does he refer to? And then we had to give sort of a indicator function to which he we're actually caring about in the input. So those are the kinds of changes you may have to make to the model to do coreference. So that one seems very easy. So the question is, what if the input was John moved to the bedroom, and the question is, where did John move to? And yeah, in this case, it just needs to pay attention to that one sentence and can immediately agglomerate that. And then you just want to make sure it doesn't ignore it in the next couple of iterations if you have a fixed number of passes that you have over the input, and then you can just output bedroom. But maybe your answer is, it's never seen the word bedroom before? Oh, I see. Yeah, so if they're completely new words that describe new existing kinds of relationships, it would also have some trouble. In this case, it probably would still work because it doesn't really care about that many things in between, unless now you have certain things like John slept in the bedroom versus John went to the bedroom, and now you have different kinds of questions, and it needs to know what the actual action and verb is. And then if you don't have that in the training data, then it couldn't do it. But in general, this kind of model struggles with these things that I mentioned, which is this thing right here in the first version of this model is still a softmax. So if you've never seen a certain answer at training time, like the word hallway or bedroom, maybe they've only went to kitchens and living rooms or something like that, it would never be able to give you that kind of answer. But there are now ways to extend these kinds of models with the pointer sentinel idea and generally pointers that learn to point to certain parts of your input. And that's one way of fixing that problem. And you'll implement, I think, pointers for your PA4 as well. But a lot of the other kinds of ideas are not that unreasonable for those kinds of models too. So the question is, how do we compute the M vector? So the M vector here is going to be defined as the last hidden state of this time sequence model, which inside has a GRU, but also has this global gate on top of it. So for simplicity, for instance, if a fact is very relevant based on this attention score G, then H will just be computed as a standard GRU. Right, so this is just a single scalar. If that single scalar is 1, then we'll just have its GRU. Now the last hidden state of this GRU as it goes over the inputs, we'll just define as M. So that's for one pass. But then the second pass will actually take that last hidden state and give it as input together with the previous hidden state M. Actually, never mind. Yeah, let's just assume that's your M state. There are lots of modifications that you can make to this model, but they're not that relevant, and they usually only change like your accuracy, 1 to 2 or 3%. So the simplest iteration, it's just going to be going through these M's independently, and then you can try various options of incorporating this last hidden state M also at the very last time step, but you can kind of ignore that. All right, awesome. So the answer module also just a GRU, but one little trick here, which is we don't just have the previous hidden state AT and some word vector, because there are no word vectors, there are no inputs for the answer module. And so what we have instead is we'll concatenate the question vector at every single input state here, as well as the previous words output. So if we have this longer sequence of things that we're generating, then we have here the previous word that we generated each time. So this is similar to machine translation, for instance, where we give it as input every time the word we just generated in the time step before. Cool. All right. Now there's a bunch of related work. Many of these papers we've talked about. Well, actually not that many. Some of them. So sequence-to-sequence learning is one such model. We didn't really cover the neural Turing machines and some of these other models here with somewhat overpromising titles like teaching machines to read and comprehend. I don't think any of these models are really comprehending that much or reading in the sense that people read, but it's similar kinds of models that are having memory components as they go over different kinds of text. The one that's most relevant and was actually developed in parallel to this dynamic memory network is the memory network from Jason Weston and the extension to them in end-to-end memory networks. And so it makes sense to look a little bit at the differences between these. Basically, both of these kinds of models have mechanisms to compute some representations for input, then scoring, attention, and responses. The main difference is that for the memory networks, the input representations are a bag of words and then have some nonlinear or linear embeddings that explicitly encode the position of each word. And then the memory networks iteratively run a variety of different kinds of functions, both for attention and responses. So essentially, each of these 4 components is a very different kind of network. And it's not just a sequence model. And so the dynamic memory network here really takes as its core a neural sequence model. Could be a GRU, which we've tried, we've compared to LSTMs. Turned out LSTMs got the same performance, but have more parameters. So we use just a GRU. And what's nice about this is that will naturally capture that we have a temporality in our sequence. Right? So if we ask, like, did this happen before? Or if we want to do sequence tagging and things like that, we can immediately do that with this model. So we have basically a much broader range of different kinds of tasks that we can solve with this model. All right, now before we get to evaluation, we'll have a research highlight.
Cool. Hi, everyone. So first of all, happy belated International Women's Day. And so for the research highlight, I'm going to present the paper, Learning Program Embeddings to Propagate Feedback on Student Code by Chris Peach et al. Great. So if you remember your first days of programming, and for some of you, if you've taken 106A here, you probably remember Carol, you'll know how important it is to get feedback from your teachers about what you're coding to become a better programmer. But now let's imagine that you're teaching a class that has, let's say, an online course with 1 million students. How do you actually make sure that you give feedback to everyone? Wouldn't it be nice if you just gave feedback, or if you graded, let's say, about 100 assignments, and you could propagate that feedback to the other students in that course? So that's kind of the motivation for creating program embeddings. The idea is that you want to be able to cluster these programs together by similarity in some ways. So, and you all know that we can do that with sentences. We've seen that a lot in this class. And the question is, can we also represent programs with vector representations such that these vectors capture something about the functionality of the code, even if the code, let's say, crashes or doesn't really compile? So you know how to encode sentences. You've seen lots of different architectures to do that. Usually we train them on some task which requires modeling the language, and then we can use that neural network to create embeddings for new inputs. So can we do the same thing for computer programs? And here, this is what was presented in the paper. And this is for a very simple program. You can see the program in the middle is just like to put a beeper and move. And on the left side, we can see that there are two precondition states. So let me just like define what precondition, postcondition means. So a precondition is a current state of the Carol world. For example, Carol is in the first square, and there is no beeper in the world. So that could be like a state. So that's a precondition. And then once you execute the program, we get to a postcondition. It's like where Carol ends up after we execute that program. So as you can imagine, for one program, we can actually have a lot of different preconditions. And then once you execute the program, we have different postconditions. So here you see two samples of P1 is like one precondition. Once you execute the program, we get to Q1. We also have another example, PK here, and which brings us to QK. And you can imagine we have lots of these pre-condition, post-condition pairings. So like the first step in this model is that we want to encode the state. So we encode the precondition state. We get a vector representation for that state. Then we apply the matrix MA, which is actually the embedding that we're trying to learn. So we apply that, and then we get an output from that, which we are then decoding into what we predict to be the postcondition. So it's in some ways like similar to the approach that we see that we see like at the beginning of the class with word2vec, where we are trying to like learn this feature matrix like MA in this case. So the goal is that MA captures something about the meaning of this particular program. And you can also see that like the encoder and decoder, they follow very similar structures that you've seen in class. We apply a linear function with a nonlinearity around it. And also for decoding, it's very similar. So we use the output from our cell in the middle. And then we again apply a linear function with a nonlinearity afterwards. So the loss function here mainly consists of two parts. We have a prediction loss, which measures how well we can predict the postcondition given our precondition and the program. And we also have an autoencoding loss, which measures how good our encoder and decoders are. So in a way, like if we have good encoders and decoders, we should be able to also reconstruct our precondition. And the last term is just the regularization, which you also have seen many times in this class. So, but if we have like a complex program, we would like to actually combine, or like we can't like necessarily train the previous model on all different kinds of programs, right? So we want to be able to use these building blocks and then create a representation for a more complex program. And here so you've already seen recursive neural nets in this class, so we can use recursive neural nets to do that. And the cool thing about programs is they are already in a tree structure, so we don't even have to create that tree structure, but it's already given to you. So given that tree structure, we can reconstruct a recursive neural network, which exactly like follows the same structure. And then we combine these embeddings that we've learned from the first task together recursively until we reach the root. And the idea is that the embedding, or like the activation at the root, in this case is the one thing that's like blue at the top, that representation should contain something about, or like the meaning, the logic of the entire program. And we can also train this recursive neural network because when we are combining these embeddings together, we also multiply them with parameters which we can learn by training them on an objective. Great. So just to summarize, what this paper presented is a neural network architecture which allows us to encode programs as a mapping from preconditions space to a postcondition space using recursive neural networks. And the advantage of using recursive neural networks in this case is that we are also using the structure of the program itself. And once we have these learned representations, we can use them for lots of different tasks. So going back to our initial motivation, we can use them to cluster students by their similarity of programs. So let's say once we grade at around 100 students, we can use that feedback and give it to other students as well who have similar programs. So that's like essentially the feedback prediction part. And another application is to actually perform knowledge tracing over multiple code submissions. So an example of that is like when you're solving a programming challenge, you might actually submit multiple times. It would be interesting to actually see your trajectory. So as a teacher, you can oftentimes see how the student's progressing, and you can see if the student actually understood what they were programming or if they just kind of like randomly guessed the code. So this is actually still ongoing research by something that I've actually been working on with Chris. So for example, when you and possible interventions that you might want to predict in an online course is like, when should you give a hint to the student? Should you show a motivational video right now? Or should you maybe like choose a different next exercise? And in order to do that, one thing that you could do is like, given all these program submissions by the student, you convert them into the program embeddings using the approach that we just saw. And then you can feed them into another recurrent neural network and then predict future student success. Yeah, so that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to find me after class, and I would love to chat about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. That was great. All right. That was awesome. So now let's look at the various tasks that we can apply the dynamic memory network to. So the first one here is the baby data set. It's actually not a great data set in some ways because it is actually a synthetic data set, which is in some ways a big no-no for a lot of NLP people because that was what the field had done many, many years ago. We've moved past that since and actually can use real language. But I still think it was an interesting data set for a while. We've solved it to such a high degree at this point already that it's not that interesting anymore. We've sort of solved it as a community fairly quickly. But it's interesting in that it gives you a lot of necessary but not sufficient conditions for systems to be able to answer certain kinds of questions. So simple things like counting, like X goes into the room, Y goes into the room, how many people are in the room. Right? So it's very simple, and if you give it enough examples, it will be able to predict some number between 1 to 10 or something like that. Or simple negation, like John did not go into the bathroom. Is John in the bathroom? No. Things like that. So if it sees a lot of certain kinds of patterns, it can do this. Sometimes indefinite knowledge, just simple sentences like John may have gone to the hallway or the bathroom. Is he in the bathroom? Maybe. So super simple stuff like that. Basic induction, positional reasoning, and this one is actually a little harder. You basically have a bunch of inputs saying the castle is north of the beach and the beach is east of the desert. Now John moves, west and north from the beach. Is he south of the desert or something like that? Probably doesn't make sense, but you get the idea. So those kinds of reasoning were a little hard, but it turns out there's another version of this data set where you can sample 10,000 examples instead of 1,000, and then most of the models can also solve positional reasoning. It's just a matter of how many examples you've seen. So in many ways, this was encouraging briefly, and then we moved on to real data sets that use real kinds of real language. The agent motivation here is fairly simple too. We basically showed a lot of examples of somebody eating or drinking something, and then you ask why did they drink something, and it's because they were thirsty. And so thirsty is sort of the simple answer. So again, very simple kinds of patterns, but again, interesting and necessary conditions. If you can't even solve that with your deep neural network model, you will never get to a real question answering system either that can solve all kinds of more complex types of reasoning. What's more interesting is when we actually applied it to real sentiment. So here, the question is essentially always the same. You could almost ignore the question vector and just have a 0. It adds essentially just some bias weights to the model. But what was cool is that model actually got the state-of-the-art on sentiment analysis on the Stanford Sentiment Tree Bank. And it's the same architecture. But again, sadly, it's not the same exact model. So the hyperparameters here are different. And one such hyperparameter is, for instance, how many times do you need to go over the input before you want to predict the final answer? And sadly, you get different state-of-the-art results depending on the task. So for sentiment, the best number for fine-grained sentiment, so very negative, negative, neutral, positive, very positive classifications for each sentence, did best when you allow the model to go over the input twice. But for various types of reasoning, such as reasoning that requires 3 different kinds of facts. So John went in the hallway is in the house is in this area. Is John in this area, yes or no, right? You now need to know and go over multiple facts. Or the simple examples like John drop the football there, where's John? So that those kinds of transitive reasonings you can create artificially, sort of transitive reasoning chains that will require multiple passes. And this also shows here that in theory, you'd only need 3 passes, but in practice, the model hadn't been able to perfectly pick up all the relevant facts at the exact right pass over the input the first time. It needed multiple times, needed to go over it multiple times. And this is assuming you don't give it the fact supervision. There's actually another data set version of the babl data set that tells you this fact is important in the first time you go over the input, and then this fact is important the second time you go over the input. If you do that, then you can get away with 3 passes for these 3 fact reasonings. But without that supervision, just training everything end-to-end, question, answer, input triplets, you need to have 5 passes to get very high accuracy here. So why is this not a task-dependent hyperparameter? It is. It is actually a task-dependent hyperparameter. And we did here, based on the development splits, the analysis, and found that the best hyperparameter of number of passes for sentiment is 2. That's exactly right. So the question is, in practice, you would just, at training time, adjust these hyperparameters and for your training data set and identify based on your development split what the best hyperparameter is. And that's exactly right. So at least you don't have to, for a variety of different tasks, think about all the different kinds of architectures that are out there, but you still have to run some hyperparameter search on what the best hyperparameters are for this architecture. So why is there no result here for 5 passes? Because compute time is costly, and it already went down after 3. And the probability, I guess our estimates of that it would magically go back up were very, very low. So we just didn't run the experiment. All right. So now let's look at a couple of examples of this attention mechanism for sentiment analysis. So we now here have a couple of examples that even the dynamic memory network got wrong when we only allowed it 1 iteration over the inputs. And what you see here is basically a coloring scheme, and the darker the color is, the larger the attention weight that G scalar is for that particular word. And so these are the kinds of examples also that you now need to get correct if you want to push the state-of-the-art in sentiment analysis. And they're kind of interesting and fun, actually. So in its ragged, cheap, and unassuming way, the movie works. You can see in the first pass over the input, it just kind of pays attention to all the things you would sensibly pay attention to for a sentiment analysis trained neural network, which is a bunch of adjectives, right? Ragged, cheap, unassuming, a little bit of way, and so on. Now, on 2 passes, the model actually is not quite certain where to pay attention to in the very first pass. A little bit of cheap, unassuming, way, somewhat oddly, and works. But in the second one, it sort of now takes into consideration the context of that whole sentence and really increases the attention to the movie working and being sort of unassuming, which is less negative than, for instance, just cheap, and now correctly classifies it as positive. Yeah?
Why does it need, why can't it do that in 1 pass? Like see all the words once and process that? Why do these multiple passes?
So the question is, why does the model need multiple passes? Why couldn't it just do it in 1 pass? I guess the trouble is that basically, as you go from left to right, and this is in some ways what we think is the reason and the intuitions that we use to build this model, but I can't definitively tell you that that is exactly why it cannot work. Because it works, so it works on in 50% or so of the cases, it gets it perfectly right. Now, these are just examples that are it didn't get it right on 0 or 1 pass, and it, basically the difference here is 0.6. So in a small subset of the sentences, it could only get it right on multiple passes. So intuitively here, what's happening is you actually agglomerate all the facts. And now with that global viewpoint of the sentence, you can now go back and having this M vector, you can now use the M vector to pay attention to every single word out there. And you can realize with that maybe some words are more important than others. So that's intuitively what you can do. If you only go from left to right once, then you cannot really incorporate the global information at every time step. You can only take the information you got from the left, or if you have a bidirectional one, from the left and the right, but not sort of the global picture of the sentence. All right, here's another fun example. The best way to hope for any chance of enjoying this film is by lowering your expectations. In the end, in the beginning here, it basically pays a little bit of attention to a lot of different things, but everything pales in comparison to the second pass where it really focuses on the expectations, a little bit that they're lowered, and realizes this is actually negative now. And when I say realizes, I'm anthropomorphizing a little bit here, so it just classifies it correctly. Yeah. The color scheme is the same inside each plot, but not across different plots. That's a great question. So does the attention converge, or does it shift again? We've noticed it converging in a lot of cases, but we also didn't run it for like 10 passes or something. It might eventually explode or do something crazy. I don't know. But in most cases, it does well. But then we also notice that it actually deteriorates sometimes. So there are some cases clearly where it then also deviates again from what it should have done. I'm sort of again, anthropomorphizing my model here a little bit, but just overthinking it. Yeah. Are the weights all summing up to 1? For this model, they do not. No, it's just sigmoids at every time step. Great question. So do we share weights of how we compose information at each pass? So yeah, so we have these different GRUs at each, as we go over the inputs. And it's actually a hyperparameter that we evaluated on. And it works slightly better across several tasks to have separate weights for each time you go over the input. My hunch is that is a balance between how much training data do you have. If you have enough training data, it's better to have more parameters there. And if you don't have enough training data, you might want to share each pass weights. Yeah. Great question. All right, second to last example. The film starts out as competent but unremarkable and gradually grows into something of considerable power. Again, focuses first as competent, incompetent, and a little bit of everything in power, and then really hones in on the power. And now the last one here I actually like a lot, which is my response to the film is best described as lukewarm. So every normal sentiment algorithm would over-index just like this one on the first pass on best. Because best, if you run like a simple unigram, naive Bayes type model, you get very, very high certainty that best correlates very much with a positive sentence. But in the second pass, it actually lowered it. And our hope here is that it realized it's actually used here as an adverb and just best describing something, but what it's actually describing is lukewarm, and then correctly classifies it as negative. All right, now last task is part of speech tagging. The difference here is that instead of triggering the answer module only at the end of the episodic memory module, we actually trigger it at every single time step. So at every single time step, you classify part of speech tags. And when you combine a couple, so one thing we don't, that's not mentioned here, is that we actually have, I think, 2 different models and we ensemble to get to the state of the art. But really, personally, who cares about 0.06 improvement on a task like part-of-speech tagging. So, but it's good to see that it can very accurately also predict sequence tasks. That's sort of the main takeaway message here. Now, in the interest of time, I'll skip the live demo and go to another fun fact or a fun aspect of this model, which is we had a new researcher join our group, Zeming Hyung, and he had a vision background, and so he said, well, there's this cool new VQA, visual question answering data set. Can't we use this model? Because I was all like, it's a general model, it's so great, everything's question answering. I was super excited. And so he basically said, all right, I'll replace the input module with one that will give us a sequence over image blocks. And he was also just new. We had implemented at this time everything in Torch. We've since moved away from Torch and then now came back to it through PyTorch, but different story. And basically replaced the input module and then checked if we can actually run visual question answering with this architecture. So what is visual question answering? Basically, same idea. Input, question, answer as training input. But the input is now a picture, an image, instead of a sequence of words. So the kinds of questions you might have here is what kind of tree is in the background, and the answer should be palm. And another simplification here, in this particular data set, the answers you can get to way above state of the art if you only ever predict a single word instead of a sequence of words, because most of the answers are just single words. So instead of running a fancy GRU for always a single time step, you just classify as softmax right away. You give the inputs that you would have given to the GRU directly to a single softmax layer. All right, now how does this input module change? We won't be able to fully appreciate this figure, to be honest, but we can get some intuition. We know convolutional neural networks, but we don't know this exact convolutional neural networks, which has a lot of bells and whistles on top. But essentially and intuitively, what's happening here is that the convolutional neural network will give us a feature vector representation for every block of the image. So in the end, every image that we get as input, we will chop into 14 by 14 and a grid of 14 by 14, and we have a feature vector for every one of these 14 by 14 grids. How is that trained? So you can actually backpropagate everything jointly as well. But as I mentioned in the beginning, with multitask learning, computer vision is further ahead in that sense than natural language processing, because most people start their convolutional network from a pre-trained convolutional neural network that usually is pre-trained on ImageNet, a really great data set. So is there yet a project that answers questions based on both images and text? And the answer is there are some small data sets, but no data set that I personally find exciting enough to have started working on it. It's really a data set problem at this point. Do you have a very compelling data set where you collect hundreds of thousands, ideally, of questions that you really need to have both an image and some text about the image to answer the questions compellingly? It's tricky because a lot of times there's some overlap. If you take the news, for instance, sometimes news images. So I thought about this for a while and thought about collecting that kind of data set. But a lot of times news images just show sort of some general thing that is barely related to the content. And so it's non-trivial to find a good data set where that's really necessary. Paintings? So the question is, will you be able to do this kind of model with paintings too? And I don't see why not. I mean, unless they're super abstract, then you have to really interpret a lot. But as long as they're realistic paintings where you actually see objects, I think as long as they're in the training data, it should do reasonably well. All right, so let's assume we have a feature vector for every single region of the image. What we're going to do is we're just, in this snake-like fashion, lay them out and now have a sequence. And now this sequence is given to, again, our bidirectional GRU block. And then the final feature vector at every time step is just a concatenation of the forward and the backward, or the left to right and right to left hidden states of these bidirectional GRUs. All right, so essentially we replaced word vectors with feature vectors from regions of images. All right, now what was amazing is that literally on the second experiment we ran, we got the state of the art on this data set. And we didn't really change the episodic memory module code, the question code, just like the input module changed, and we got state of the art on this data set. And what's even more fun is looking now at these attention visualizations. Again, it's unsupervised. The model is never given inputs onto where it should pay attention to answer a certain kind of question. So here we basically visualize this. So this is kind of the equivalent plot to what I showed you about the sentiment. But the difference here is instead of being a very dark blue, it's white. So when the whiter it is, the higher the attention score here is for that region of the image. And so when we ask what is the main color on the bus, it actually literally pays attention to that bus and then gives the answer blue. And so we can ask what type of trees are in the background, pays attention to the background and trees, answers pine. How many pink flags are there? Pays attention to the pink flags and gives the answer true. Now, in general, number questions are actually not that great. So you can see here that while this is sort of close to the best model, none of the models actually do really great on numbering because the attention mechanisms that all these different kinds of models are using are very continuous, right? All we're doing is, as we're agglomerating facts into this GRU, we're have a high attention score, and so we're agglomerate that region. But these models don't have a discrete sense of this is a discrete object and this is another discrete object. And so also if you have 50 objects, it would never give you the answer 50 because it can't count in such a fine-grained way. And of course, we have the problem that it's a classifier in the end. And so if it's never seen 39 objects at training time, it cannot produce the number or the answer 39 as a class. Right? So there are actually still problems with this, but in this particular data set, most of the number of objects are actually also relatively small. Is this in the wild? It's kind of interesting, actually. It pays attention to sort of the man-made structure, the house or barn or whatever it is in the background here, and answers no. And so I was still pretty skeptical in the beginning of why it's doing so well, but through these attention visualizations, I actually felt much better about this model. It's really clearly learning something about this domain. So again, sometimes you can't overinterpret too much. So who's on both photos? It's not like the model actually gained an understanding of that there are two photos and then captures, is their face and the same person in both and blah, blah, blah. It's just the majority object that you would answer to a who question on this is just a baby girl. So it just says girl. This one is, again, very fun. What is the boy holding? Actually literally learns to pay attention to the arm and then the surfboard and gives the answer surfboard. So this is, at this point, I felt like, okay, this is more than just sort of learning facts from just the language itself. It really takes into consideration the image. And this one here is actually another fun example of that, because there are some baselines where people compare on just looking at the image and answering, ignoring the actual question. Just like, here's an image, what's the answer? And that also does, 28% of the time, does the right thing. So there's certain patterns when you ask people, ask a question about this image, what are they going to ask? And it's capturing that sort of baseline. What's in some ways even sadder is if you just look at the question, what is the boy holding? In almost half the cases, it also gets it right, not having to look at the image at all. Right? So this is, sometimes we glance over these tables, but it's important in both your projects, and that's what we'll do when we grade them, actually really critically question what's going on in those tables. So really, what we've been able to do, what this model has been able to do when this data set first came out, we combined the two, question and images, really just only 4% or less better than just the question alone. But then this model does around 8% better than in this model, and around 12 or so than just looking at the question alone. And this is a good example of where it actually took the image into consideration. Namely, the question here is, what color are the bananas? And if you just look at the question, then the default answer that you would probably be pretty good, it would be a pretty good estimate, would be just yellow. But in this particular image, the bananas that it's paying attention to are not quite ripe yet, and it learns to give the answer green. Last one here is like, what's the pattern on the cat's fur on its tail? Actually pays attention to the tail and says stripes. So some of them are pretty incredible. And so these are, we then had put together a demo to play around with it. And these were 8 questions that we asked this demo. And I was actually kind of surprised how good it was. So what is the girl holding? A tennis racket. What is the girl doing playing tennis? These are kind of simple. And of course, it has to have seen these kinds of answers before. It has to have seen pictures from that domain. Is the girl wearing a hat? As actually a journalist had asked this. And I was already coming up with excuses because the hat is sort of black and it's black background. But then it got it right. And then what is the girl wearing? Shorts. And what's interesting also, when you ask what is wearing, it says shorts. But when you ask what color is her skirt, it actually says white. So it's kind of an interesting robustness in some ways to the questions. And then I asked what color is the ground, and said brown. And then I was like, well, but brown's the majority color. And so I asked what color is the ball, and actually got it right too, despite the ball being a very small part of the image. And so eventually, the way I found it, I broke sort of this demo was I asked, is the woman about to hit the ball? And it said yes. And I asked, did the woman just hit the ball? And it said yes again. And I was like, all right. That was the last one. So, but again, it boils down to having seen enough time, sort of certain angles, I guess, of the arm, and then that kind of question, and so on. So I don't think it's something in theory it could never pick up, but it just didn't have enough training data. All right. So in summary, I hope I could show you and motivate you and excite you for your PA4 and the various question answering projects that you're working on. Because in the end, question answering is really one of the most interesting tasks, I think, in natural language processing. And a lot of the tasks, the other tasks that we looked at in the class, you could incorporate. And I encourage you actually to think about your projects and PA4 and extensions, and like, could you incorporate other kinds of tasks into your data set and then see what happens when you try to train them jointly. The dynamic memory network can quite accurately solve a whole variety of different QA tasks, but as we'll talk about next week's lecture, in one of them, there are actually also extensions to this where you can do dynamic generation of answers and pay co-attention of the inputs and the question jointly. So still more work to be done. All right, thank you.